Hello and welcome to Where Women Talk. I'm Nadia Giordana. And if you think the studio looks a little spooky today, it is. It's almost Halloween. And our guest is a storyteller. Her name is Carol McCormick, and I'm excited to hear what she has to share with us. I know for one thing, it's going to be all about witches. Let's go talk to Carol. Hi, Carol. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nadia.
It's so much fun to have you here today. What have you got in store?
I've got a song, an old story, and then a more modern story about witches.
Fun. Let's get going.
Who were the witches? Where did they come from? Maybe your great-great-grandmother was one. Witches were wise, wise women, they say, and there's a little witch in every woman today. Witches knew all about flowers and weeds, how to use all their roots and their plants and their seeds. When people grew weary from hard working days, they knew how to help them in so many ways. When women had babies, the witches were there to hold them and help them and give them care. The witches knew stories of how life began. Don't you wish you could hear them? Well, maybe you can. Some people thought that the witches were bad. Some people feared that of the power they had, the power to help and to heal and to care. But it's not something to fear, it's a pleasure to share. This is one of the oldest witches stories I know. It comes from Germany, and it starts out, once upon a time, long, long ago, the little girl's mother said to her, "Whatever you do, don't go to Frau Hulda's house." One day, the little girl was very bored. She couldn't think of anything to do. And before you know it, she was skipping down the street right to Frau Hulda's house. She ran up the stairs and she knocked on the door. The door squeaked open and the little girl went inside. She walked down the hall. And she almost walked into this man. He was all red. Cried the little girl, and she went running down the hall. She almost ran into a man, and he was all black. Cried the little girl, and she ran into the parlor. And there, sitting in front of the fire, was Frau Hulda.
"Come in, little girl. It's so nice to see you."
Frau Hulda, when I came into your house, I almost ran into this man. He was all red.
"You don't have to be afraid of him. He's only my butler. He wears a red hat and a red cape."
Well, Frau Hulda, I went running down the hall and I almost ran into this man, and he was all black.
"Oh, that's just the man who delivers my coal. He gets that black coal dust all over him. You don't have to be afraid of him."
Well, Frau Hulda, my mother, she told me never to come and see you. Why did she tell me that?
"Come here, little girl, and you'll find out."
And the little girl walked towards the fire and towards Frau Hulda. And when she was this close, Frau Hulda went zap! And she changed her into a log of wood, and she threw that log of wood onto her fire.
"Curious little children burn so brightly."
Now, you've probably all heard of the Salem witch trials.
But did you know that Margaret Atwood dedicated her book, The Handmaid's Tale, to Mary Webster? Mary Webster lived in a little town near Salem called Hadley. It was more of a village than a town. And she was accused of witchcraft, but survived the hanging. And Margaret wrote that sometimes my grandmother would say she was our relative, and other days she'd deny it because it wasn't very respectable. Margaret wanted to write a novel about Mary Webster, but she didn't have enough information. And so instead, she wrote a long narrative poem called Half-Hanged Mary. Well, long ago, this is what I have conjured up in my imagination of what might have happened. The story starts. It's January 1865. And the pillar of the community, a man named Philip Smith, suddenly was very, very ill. He was suffering and in pain. And the Puritans in that village wondered why such a pious man who was so active in politics and the church, why would he be in so much pain? And they began thinking, there must be a witch among us, and she has cast a spell on him. But who could that witch be? Well, very soon, the men of the village decided that that witch was probably Mary Webster. She was an elderly woman, still quite strong though, who lived on a very prosperous farm at the edge of the village. Now, when Mary had become a young widow, men had come to court her. "Oh, Mary," they said, "you need a man to work this farm. Women are too delicate to do all the hard work." But Mary turned all those suitors down. And she worked very hard. And to their amazement, her farm became very prosperous. Many men envied her that prosperous farm. And it didn't sit well with them that she spoke her mind. She did not defer to male authority. She had a reputation of being very stubborn and very into speaking uncomfortable truths. Well, the farmers said when they pulled their carts past Mary's farmhouse, which was on the main road, that their horses would stop and refuse to go any further right in front of her house. And the only way they could get the animals to move forward was to go into Mary's house and to beat her. And somehow they thought that diminished her supernatural powers. And so then their horses would pull the carts past her home. And so the men of the village, they thought that Mary Webster was the witch. Now the women, they didn't think that. The women held her in high regard. For Mary would go into the woods and she would gather plants and she would use her herbal remedies to cure people who were sick. She had helped many of those women get rid of a baby or help them conceive a baby, and she was there as a midwife to help them give birth. And they all really revered her, but many of them went to see her in secret because they knew their menfolk would not approve. Well, some of the men of the village, they couldn't wait for a trial. They decided they had to take justice into their own hands. And so one evening, as Mary was in the barn milking her cow, the door burst open and men dragged her out, yelling that she was a witch in work in league with the devil. And they tied her hands together. They stuffed a rag in her mouth. And they put a rope around her neck and they hung her from a tree outside the barn. And then they left, all puffed up with their anger and their pride for what they had done. When their womenfolk heard them bragging about hanging Mary, they were very afraid. But they were so afraid of the men, they didn't feel they could go and cut Mary down. They were afraid that that accusation of witchcraft might rub off on them like soot, and so they did not speak up in her defense. It was a long night for Mary as she hung there from the rope. She started to rail and curse and really get so angry at God. Lord, she said, where is thy hope, thy justice, thy mercy? I have been a healer, helping the people of these village, and this is my reward. She was so angry. The blood pooled in her head, and she had to bite down, and her neck was so constricted, it was hard for her to breathe, and the hours seemed to drag on and on. It was as if death was perching on her shoulder like a crow, waiting to come and tear out her eyes. But then, as the night wore on, a calm descended on her, and her stubbornness and her stiff neck made her vow, I will not die for a crime I am not guilty of. And then she began to pray more earnestly than she had ever prayed in church. She prayed, oh, Lord, Lord, help me hang on. I'm not ready, not yet, please. I have more of my work to do. I promise I will be more generous and kind. Please spare my life, she prayed over and over again. And as dawn began to break, Mary, hanging from that rope, was still able to breathe. It felt like she had aged 100 years, and she realized, unlike most human beings, she would have 2 deaths. That morning, when the gloating men came to cut her down, to their astonishment, Mary Webster was still alive. And as they cut the rope and she fell to the ground, she glared at them, and when they cut her wrists or unbound her wrists, she took that cloth out of her mouth and she said, I am now a free woman. You cannot punish me for the same crime twice. I am now free. And so it was that night. Mary not only gained her freedom, but she gained a new name. From that time on, she was called Half-Hanged Mary. And Philip Smith died soon after her ordeal, but Mary Webster lived another 14 years. And she went through with her promise to God. She didn't always go to church now on Sunday. Sometimes she stayed home and rested from all the hard work that she did. But she realized that when she did die, there needed to be someone to replace her as the healer and midwife in the village. And so she began training apprentices. And so it was, 4 years later, from that terrible night, that Cotton Mather wrote a book with a detailed description of Mary Webster, the accused witch, and her supposed victim, Philip Smith. And that book laid the scene and set the stage for the Salem witch trials, in which 150 people were put into jail and 20 people were executed.
Welcome back, Carol.
Well, thank you.
That was delightful. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
It's always so wonderful when I can take that witch attire off. And I often wonder what would happen if I couldn't take it off.
Yes, yes.
Because people would treat you differently.
People would, and I've been looking at some of the statistics that you sent me about historically how women were treated and how the witchcraft thing all came about and how it was. And I'm going to look down here at the notes. Apparently, the high point was from 1580 to 1630. It was called the Counter-Reformation and the European Wars of Religion. 50,000 women were prosecuted as witches.
It's, you know, the scholars argue about this. They go anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000. You know, they didn't keep good records. But there was mostly women. There were some men, but it was mostly women, and there were some children.
Yeah, I heard about there were some children. 80% were women, from what it says here, and then they're actually only certain of about 12,000 that died, but there are many more that there just are no records.
The vigilantes, yeah, they didn't even get to trial. They just took justice into their own hands. And the thing about it was these women were usually single women and over the age of 40, which in those days would be considered elderly, you know, and they didn't have a man to defend them, you know, or to stand up for their righteousness. And so if you didn't look very into practicing your religion, if you thought for yourself, you questioned the male authority, you know, and with the rules, the way they were written, if you were accused and convicted of witchcraft, all your property would be divvied up to the people that accused you.
What do you think were some of the reasons, the underlying reasons that this happened to these women?
It's an ancient fear of women in power, I think. Men didn't understand some of the things that women were doing intuitively and some of the healing skills that they practiced and their connection with the earth. And, you know, they were different. And they were afraid that these women were going to incite the younger women who they had under their thumb and their control.
And I suppose if they weren't as religious as the town folk expected them to be, because we know even today that there are different levels of the way people practice their Christianity, and some do more than others, and some of that had to play in there if they didn't look the part.
Mm-hmm. And didn't follow the rules, if they were more into spirituality than religion, you know, and were more thinking for themselves. It's just like crones today. You know, the crones, we aren't as attractive to men as we were when we were young, and so it gives us more courage to stand up to some things that we think are wrong, or ideas that we think are a little warped.
Yeah, and today a man would be considered assertive if he spoke up, and if he kind of went his own way, he'd be his own man, he'd be more assertive. A woman would be something else, and definitely the word bitchy would come up.
Yes, yeah.
So not a lot has changed.
Yeah, unfortunately.
We aren't going to be burned at the stake.
Although it's encouraging to me to see young women speaking up. When I compare, you know, some of the daughters and daughter-in-laws in our family, they're much more independent than I was and have their own opinions. They don't have to always agree with their male partners.
That's true.
Think for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've completely lost track of time. We're probably getting close to being out of time. So do you have any parting words?
It's time to change, you know, and change is uncomfortable, but it comes to the point where the baby has to be born. You know, you've gone through the labor, and I think we have in society, our culture needs to change. And it isn't going to always feel easy. The oldest story I know, which I think I've shared with you before, is only 4 lines. And it's, there was once a woman who lived in hell. She could leave at any time. She never did. She knew the names of the streets. And that applies to men too. You know, in our humanness, we resist change, and we need to be responsible for what is happening. We want a more civil, just culture where all lives are valued.
Familiarity, yeah. And definitely a lot of things need to change at this point in time in our society. Carol, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank
This
you for
is a
giving me the opportunity.
delicious change of pace.
Yes, and it was shocking to me, Nadia, when I went through my files, because I've been doing Halloween programs for 40 years, and so many of the stories were so stereotyping witches as evil.
Mhm.
You know, it's hard to find where, like in the song that I sang, you know, that witches were the healers and the midwives.
Thank you for this insight, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Where Women Talk.